Hey, thanks for sticking with me as I learn to do these disclaimer videos, these instruction videos, and this is all a learning process for me. I'm just trying to get better at it, so I thank you for your patience. This will be the first disclaimer video for my push to first bold video, and more will probably likely follow as I bring in more source material to discuss. So here we go. Just really quick, the audio in this got a really terrible echo. I messed with some settings in the recording, and so I'll never do that again, and I just thank you for putting up with that. It's not on every clip, it's just on a couple clips, but yeah, it's terrible. It's terribly annoying. But thank you for putting up with that.
Passive apperception into two categories. Jung, basically, for the most part, teaches one, which is here on the left side. So in Jung's view, the passive function becomes reduced in quality, it becomes kind of archaic, and it becomes coupled with another function.
Why did I say that Jung teaches basically one? This is going to be really hard because there's so much information in chapter 11 on differentiated versus undifferentiated, passive, active versus passive, abstract versus archaic, or differentiated versus archaic, and the concrete forms of the functions. I might make a video on this. That might be the continuation of this video, where I just read and explain some quotes from chapter 11 on concrete. And I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to bring in a whole bunch of that information if you want to sit through it. But in essence, my takeaway from all of that is that Jung found something called differentiation and undifferentiation, active and passive. And a function that was concrete, meaning originally that it was built into another function. I don't think at that point he had decided when he first realized that is happening. I think his first attempt to understand what was going on was to understand which function was directing another function. So, and this does not have to do with consciousness. This is how functions work, just how they work. A function will be concretized into another function that's leading, whether that's happening consciously or unconsciously. So a lot of things are happening unconsciously. I mean, this is Jung's theory. This is the whole reason that, this is a lot of discovery that gets attributed to him, is that I'm starting to understand, that I've started to learn, is his idea of the unconsciousness of our human psyche. That seems to be, from what I'm starting to discover, attributed to Jung. And there are a lot of things happening, and as I go throughout the day, the quotes will come up to me. I'm trying to do this backwards, because I have started to discover this, and now to try and root this, to try and go back and figure out where I had come to these conclusions from, is going to be a challenge. But I'm going to try, and as I go, I will bring some more quotes in. But the idea is that these things where he started to realize this concretization, that there's a function leading, unconsciously a lot of things are happening, and just in general how functions work. He's trying to explain this, and a function will lead in an admixture and a function will follow, for everyone, because that's how we do anything. For example, to prove something, to even prove something, that something is concrete, to be empirical and formulate empirical evidence and root it in reality, everyone, in their science class had to try to do that at one point in their life. And to do that, the function of sensing had to take the lead, and the function of thinking had to follow, because you had to reduce thought into something tangible, and you had to found conceptual ideas in the phenomenal world. So everyone does that. Everyone had to do that from one time or another. So this is not talking about consciousness, your personality type. This is just how functions work. And you need to have I've realized that we need to have an understanding of how functions work first in order to objectively figure out what our type is. Unless you have an understanding of how functions are working and how our psyche is working, then otherwise all this is going to become Myers-Briggs land, where it's just some kind of horoscope, and you have some kind of noumenal image of what a certain type is like, and then you try to match that image to other people intuitively, and that brings in all your bias and all of your noumenal bias, and then images get distorted and based on your personal perspective. And so what dominant intuitive is to you may be completely different to what it is to somebody else. Anyway, so I've struggled with that, and that's what this is all getting at. So we need to find what is leading, and what space that function is being pulled into. So one space, fundamentally, if you want to know where this general idea of this type theory keeps coming back. I just made a new video for video, it's video 2.2 in this playlist, and it talks about where this is all getting, the quote from Jung that this is all getting founded into, that is all taken from. So if you haven't watched that video yet, I encourage you to do that. So concrete functions is where this all starts, and understanding that there's a function that becomes passive, and there's a function that leads another function in kind of function pairs. That's not always the case. Sometimes we use something called the abstract version of that function, which is the differentiated version of that function, meaning it's not concretized with anything else. So the function is pure. And I like to say abstract. I like to say the abstract form because later differentiation, Jung starts to use that to say things like more differentiated or less differentiated, and then that turns into almost like a synonym for type, for your conscious primary function being the most differentiated, and then the other functions being more mixed together with something else. So once you start to understand the concrete functions, then you start to see that it becomes necessary to find in order to make the theory consistent. Jung basically gives us in chapter 11, he gives us some starting points, and this is the starting point. He gives us definitional material for sensation leading thinking. Thinking takes a passive role and is reduced into sensation. He calls that concrete thinking. He gives us definitional material for concrete feeling, which is feeling reduced into sensation. He gives us concrete material for, I'm pretty sure it's, and I might bring the quotes later, but I'm probably going to anyway, but concrete intuition, which is even, so this is why it's not type, it's not a conscious and auxiliary Myers-Briggs tertiary inferior. That's not what this is about. He gives us definitional material for sensation leading intuition, and he calls that a concrete form. So, and most of these definitions are rooting another function into sensation in their concrete forms, and I try to preserve those definitions in my diagram for my spaces diagram. If you look at the space in the diagram for, which I'll probably bring up in another video, but the space for the phenomenal world, you'll see all of Jung's definitions there: concrete feeling, concrete sensing, concrete thinking, and concrete intuition. You'll see them all there. That's because I really want to preserve his definitions and his labels. But that's only 1/4 of the picture, and I cannot find the other fourths. If you can, in psychological types, if you can find the other 4 corners of that box, and you can find where all the functions are being passive and intuition is taking the lead, and all the functions are being passive. So go back. Intuition is taking the lead, even when intuition is taking the lead over sensation. So it's not, we're not talking about conscious types. We're not talking about dominant this and that. It's not about your type. We're talking about just the natural workings in your mind. So if you can find that, please tell me, because I have not found that, where intuition is taking the lead and the other functions are being concretized into intuition. So what I found then was that concrete tends to mean reduced into sensation. The only place that that's not the case is when he talks about concrete sensation, and then it takes a flip there. So more on that later. But still, I've tried to preserve it as much as possible to keep the theory consistent. Intuition, so then you need to also find the other quadrant. So thinking, you need to find where thinking is leading and the other functions are, including feeling, is being passively led by thinking. And then you need to find all the functions for feeling, how they are passively led by feeling. And I have not found that in psychological types, unless it is in more of the, I'm discovering this, honestly, as I do this, but unless it is found in more of the earlier chapters, where he talks about sensuous, so sensationalism and things like that. But I'll get to that when we go there. So what I've done is I've taken the more definitional materials that he has, that we do have concrete definitions for, from Jung, that are more rooted in sensation. And I've based that, I've took that as the base and done what we all need to do without doing You Cannot Have the Functioning Theory, of taking that and flipping it down to intuition and saying, so what does this look like when intuition is in the lead? Flipping that up into thinking. What is this like when thinking is in the lead for each of the crossed functions, when the material is being passive and being pulled into the thinking space? What is that when it's flipped down into feeling and everything is being passive and being pulled into feeling? Because only then can you see which function is your habitual motivation. So, and that's the basis for this whole thing. So that all is rooted in the definitions for concrete in chapter 11, concrete thinking, concrete feeling, concrete intuition, and things like that, passive and active. And that's where I get this pulled or reduced from. Pushed in is something different. That's something I came up with on my own. So, and if that makes you feel skeptical, then I mean, just skip that part of the test. But if you take that part of the test and you think it's good or whatever, that may give you more benefit into understanding your type, then I hope that helped. But that will be, I'll get into that more as we go, like as we get to that part of the test. Okay, where I am starting to see that I can find definitional material for concrete forms where the other functions are leading. For example, more of a passive form when other functions are being passive and feeling is taking the lead, will, I predict, be found in chapter 10 when Jung talks about unconsciousness, or for example, the section on feeling, where he talks about unconscious feeling, where he talks about introverted unconscious feeling and extroverted unconscious feeling. When he talks about the unconscious form, that's what he's talking about. It's reduced into feeling. And you, at that point, you'll see something like inferior. You would probably tend to describe it as inferior thinking, but he goes into a lot of the other functions taking a passive role while feeling is taking the lead. That's something I will probably get into as I continue these these videos, continue this subject of making disclaimers of this video.
So I'm going to try and show you quickly the basics of what's happening with a passive apperception when it's being pulled in. Here is one example called Concrete Thinking by Carl Jung. This is your phenomenal world, and this divide here is a divide that happens between the two spaces of two function spaces. Your phenomenal world is the place where you can touch and taste.
So I don't know how much I need to provide for you in talking about my spaces theory, or what I describe my spaces interpretation. I guess it's more of an interpretation. What happened was, in the Discord servers, in Slack, in talking with people online about type, I found that there was inconsistency in how people were talking about function types and cognitive functions. Some people would call something possibilities. They call intuition possibilities, and then think that that's all intuition was. They would call feeling like likes and dislikes, and think that that's all that it is. They would talk about the action of feeling, which is like evaluating or assessing endopathic topics in your heart space, where they would only talk about the assessing and judging part, and then they wouldn't talk about the heart space, which is important. And people would talk about intuiting objects that are physically real, but they wouldn't talk about intuiting the possibilities. So it just shows all the admixtures, all the concrete forms in people. A lot of people talk about intuition like it's their gut instinct, but what I found is that intuition, if you see intuition as your gut instinct, what that is a physical representation of intuition. So that's being led by sensation. And what people don't understand is that if all you know about it, for example, if all you knew about intuition was that it was your gut instinct, that is evidence not that you're intuitive type, but that you're a sensing type, and then using intuition as a reduced material for sensing for the phenomenal world. So spaces gives you a more concise picture of what a full-fledged abstract function actually is. And so please take a look at my spaces video. I don't even know if my spaces video does it justice, but each function, I mean, so you can do this yourself. You don't need my spaces video. Just do this. You can do it yourself. When you talk about a cognitive function, we have to have, these are the bare minimum. You have to have at least two things. You need to know what action that function is doing, because each function is an action. So you need to have kind of like a verbal representation of that function. So like the function of feeling, the action of that is feeling. And you should have at least one synonym of what that is so that you understand what that is, because feeling is Jung's label, but you should at least create a synonym. For me, it's assessment. It's making assessment. It's directing assessment at a material. So that is, and sensing, for example, is using, the action will be using your five senses. So you need to at least have an action word that represents each of the functions to you. Now that you have the action that's being done by you need to have an understanding of what kind of objects that action is able to act upon. So, and number 3, you need to know the material that's being generated by that function. Because just having one part, that's just a third of what the function is. So for example, when you use sensation, when you're using your five senses, the resulting apperception is a sensation. The material that gets generated from using your five senses is a sensation. So you need to understand the material that gets generated, because when people start to conflate these things, intuition a result of intuiting becomes something more or less the lines of possibilities. So a great possibility is actually the result of the action of intuiting. So possibility is not intuition. Intuiting is not intuition. Both of them working together create the function of intuition. Now for each function, now you know the thing that they're generating, and you have kind of a synonym of what that thing is, so you can understand. So for example, thinking, the action of thinking, creates thoughts. In its essence, it's thoughts, but go ahead yourself and make a synonym for thoughts. What is a thought? A thought is an idea, a theory, a concept, a reason, a conclusion. There's all those things are parts of what thoughts are, results of the action of thinking. So, and those all are in your thinking space because you can't touch a thought with your five senses. So now you understand the spaces, and you come to the spaces. The space is the realm where the function can operate, and the types of materials that a function can operate on. So once you have those three things, you have the action, you have the resultant material, and you have the type of materials that a function can interact upon. Now you get a clear picture of what each of the functions is, without which we only have, and I've only had, just a piece of the puzzle and a part of the function. And you will run into the error of, as I've done, as I continually try to strive to not do, of describing that function and interpreting it based on how it operates in you, and not getting the full picture of how it operates. So that's the idea behind those spaces. Kind of lost track there.
In the tangible world, with using abstract sensing. The knowledge and information in your mind space is a completely different space than the tangible world. Your mind has things inside, information that you can't touch with your senses, while the phenomenal world has objects and experiences which you can't perceive with your mind unless your senses give them to your mind. And your senses can't give them to your mind directly. It has to be fed into information, so your mind can do logical intellectualizing with that information. Abstract thinking is using your intellect with the knowledge and information in your mind. So to understand passive apperception, it is when one function is being led by another. For the example of concrete thinking, this is when abstract thinking is led.
Okay, so for this video, this one specifically, I will not be bringing in source material for the idea of spaces. My understanding of spaces, and if I find something good, I'll bring it over and I'll attach it to this video. So what I have to say that this is my explanation of functions, and you might have a better explanation, and I don't know how far my explanation needs to have backed up material, because I feel like I think it seems like I'm just explaining necessities, what's necessary, the natural progression of psychological types of just reading it. I don't understand how you could operate outside of this understanding. There could be another better explanation, but you need to have at least those three pieces of a cognitive function to be able to have a grasp of what the function is. Is there source material for that? For knowing that each function has an action, a material, and a functioning space? Okay, I think there is. And I've brought it before. For example, we know that functions all have materials. That is the apperception. That is the apperceived material. Jung even calls them materials. So I might bring that in. And then we do know that functions operate in a space, as I've brought before if you listen to my 2.2 video. So I mean, that is clear. And we do know that functions are actions, don't we? I mean, I haven't really brought anything to explain that, but if you don't believe that functions is an action, a function has an action, then what is it directing? I mean, direction is the action, the directing of the function. So I guess I could just quote some chapter 11 stuff on directing a function, but I don't know if that's necessary. But I mean, eventually I have to bring those quotes in anyway to talk about concrete and direct and indirect. So
the problem is this passive thinking in abstract sensing. When this happens, there are so many examples that are possible, and the examples tend to be very different from each other. When this happens in a type, for example, when thinking becomes passive and abstract sensing takes the lead, the personality tends to be very naturalistic. The only things that abstract...
The literal word that Jung used was materialistic. I used the word naturalistic. I don't think Jung used the word naturalistic, but Jung does use the word materialistic. And if you read his definition of materialistic thinking, that's basically what I see as naturalistic or naturalistic empirical science for the most part. So that's just my opinion, I guess.
Sensing that your senses can accept as a real idea are ideas that can be explained in a tangible way. So one example of a concrete thought is the idea that life is nothing but molecules and atoms uniquely organized in the universe. In order for sensing...
And this is a exercise for you, if you want to do what I've done. Nothing but is a key part of seeing the concrete forms in the other spaces. So whenever it's concrete, whenever it's phenomenalized, it's nothing but a material in the phenomenal space. Whenever it's noumenalized and put in intuitive space, it's nothing but a noumenal material. Whenever it's put in the feeling space and concretized to a feeling space, or whenever a function is passively reduced into a feeling space, it is nothing but endopathic material. And whenever it's in the being reduced into the thinking space from another space, it's nothing but a thought, nothing but knowledge or information in your mind. So you can do that yourself, and then think and try to imagine scenarios using your intuition of and using your noumenal space, what that means for each of those spaces. And so that's it for the first part of the disclaimer video. Go ahead and give me some comments, issues that you think I should bring up, and I will continue the disclaimer videos as 3.2, 3.3. My next part of this series of disclaimers is going to be talking about just bringing in quotes from Jung on concrete forms, and talking about concrete and direct, indirect, etc.